Okay, going. I hope it's going. This is Caelum, Becky, Paige, and Katie, and they're presenting over bilingualism in deaf schools.
Okay, so we're going to go over some basic need-to-know facts, just basically some terms, some quick tips and facts, and 2 terms that are very important to our presentations, oralism and autism. So there's 4 different terms that you can use when referring to, the spectrum of deafness. There's capital D, which refers to culturally deaf people. It's more a socially oriented definition, and the central component of it is the fact that they use sign language. Then there's deaf with a capital F, which represents the fluidity of their lives, that it's very bicultural, so they can go from the hearing world to the deaf world. Lowercase d just refers to the audiological condition of being deaf. And then H is hard of hearing. So this is kind of the confusing term because it's very vague. There's no hard and fast line between hard of hearing and deaf. And it's just saying that there's some residual hearing, but you don't really know how much. Okay, so then some quick tips and facts. Not every deaf person uses sign language. Some people get cochlear implants, some people get hearing aids, some people will rely on lip reading, other people will write down to communicate. Not every deaf person is a part of the deaf community, so some people choose not to affiliate with the deaf community because they get cochlear implants and are trying to assimilate into the hearing community, or they just become deaf later in life. So if your grandpa becomes deaf at 80, he's likely not going to be a part of the deaf community because he didn't grow up with American Sign Language, he didn't grow up with all the cultural traditions. Not every member of the deaf community has hearing loss, so there's a program called CODA, which is Child of Deaf Adults. So a lot of times, or I think it's like 90% of kids, their parents are not deaf, and then I think the same goes for the others. So a lot of times, deaf parents will have give birth to hearing children, so then their children will learn ASL even though they're not deaf. And then approximately 17% of the U.S. Population classifies as hearing impaired, and this includes both deaf and hard of hearing. But one important thing to underline is that the deaf community has never accepted the term hearing impaired. They do not see themselves as disabled. They do not see it as an impairment. They see it as a demeaning word that tarnishes their ability to be fully functioning, capable adults, and it diminishes their rich culture that they have. Okay, so the 2 terms that we want to go over real quick are oralism and autism. So oralism is the education for deaf students through oral language by use of lip reading, mimicking mouth shapes, breathing patterns, instead of sign language in the classroom. So the big thing that's wrong with this is oftentimes they were punished for using ASL in the classroom. That was their native natural language. They were trying to use it in classrooms, and the teachers would smack them with a ruler and tell them to sit on their hands so they couldn't sign. A lot of times it's a way of seeing them, deaf students, in order to assimilate into the hearing world, and oftentimes it wasn't effective. They would go through years and years of schooling and be able to say maybe 3 words. And then autism is a discriminatory attitudes towards a specific group of people, so saying it's the belief that you're superior because you have the ability to hear. And so these are just 2 terms that are very important to keep in mind while we continue with our presentation.
Okay, so next I'm going to be going over the ASL and then English bilingualism. So what is it and what are the differences between the 2? So first of all, we'll start with what is ASL. For those of you who don't know, ASL stands for American Sign Language. It's recognized as it's a complete language by itself. It has its own rules regarding word order, punctuation, and grammar. So it relies upon physical signs made by moving your hands, your face, and your body, but it's not universal across everyone who's deaf. So an ASL speaker wouldn't be able to understand BSL, which is British Sign Language. So someone who's French and is deaf wouldn't be able to understand ASL unless they were raised in it. So some differences between ASL and spoken English is that in ASL, vision is the most useful tool to a deaf person, whereas with spoken English, we rely on hearing and see that as the most useful tool to communicate. ASL produces words through physical signs and using the body, whereas spoken English uses words that are produced through the use of the mouth and the vocal cords. ASL relies upon body positions and facial expressions, whereas spoken English relies upon different tones and inflections. And then ASL finds difficulty translating from ASL to printed English. So conventions are used, like capitalization or gloss, they're used differently. So a good example of showing these differences is asking a question. In English, spoken English, we rely upon a change in our tone to ask a question. It goes up at the end whenever you ask a question. So in ASL, that's changed by, your eyes are wide and you lean forward and you raise your eyebrows. English bilingualism is then, bilingualism is the development and use of 2 or more languages. So ASL is not simply a physical representation of English. It's a unique language that operates differently and has different rules than spoken English. So when hearing impaired individuals learn to read, write, and speak English, they're developing and using a completely different language. And because they're developing and using a completely different language in a different way, it's also considered bimodal bilingualism. So ASL English bilingualism requires bimodality, which is the development of language using more than one mode or platform. So not only must they learn a different language, they must also develop a different mode of communication, so either talking or writing instead of signing. So why would they want to acquire bilingual abilities? This can be used to establish communication with their parents, children, or spouse. As Paige said, a lot of times kids will be born to deaf parents and they will be able to hear, and that creates a language barrier, or the opposite, parents are able to hear but their child is born deaf. It also helps develop different cognitive abilities, and it allows them to fully communicate with the world that surrounds them.
And then talking about how English is taught in schools, you have to, of course, consider English as a second language to them. So you have to consider like when and if ASL is actually taught. There are 3 different kind of schools or ways of teaching English to deaf students. First is bilingual, bicultural, which is the most popular or preferred method when just teaching English as like a second language. Is when English is strictly taught like reading from a paper. They know ASL, they're fluent in it, they grew up in it, and they literally just are taught by, here's a piece of paper with words on it, this is what this word means, and like if you have a word like paper, they would sign the word for paper so they understand this word printed like this means paper. Some of the benefits is that it's highly accessible because they have ASL as a base language. If you don't have ASL, you can't ask questions about the new language you're trying to learn. And children who are born to hearing parents, they can be taught ASL together along with English. Let me rephrase that. The children will be taught ASL along with their parents, and they will be taught English from their parents. Some of the disadvantages to that is that it's not commonly taught outside of deaf schools. It's considered too much of a hassle. Teachers in like mainstream education don't have time for that. And students with hearing parents, although they're being taught ASL at the same time as the children, they don't really have anyone at home to model proper ASL for them. And then the second way is auditory oral. This is basically the one that's not really used unless it's an absolute have to. It doesn't use sign language at all. They're not taught ASL. Students are, at the youngest possible age, are basically taken to somewhere and they're taught by scientists and teachers how to use their residual hearing. And the earlier the better, because they're trying to create new pathways for at least a little bit of hearing. And then students are also taught to speech read or lip read, which a disadvantage of that is that it's not very effective half the time. Well, more like 70% of the time you're missing that, and you won't be able to tell what the person's saying. And if you don't catch it early enough, like if you don't realize that the student is deaf and you can't create those new auditory pathways early enough, there's no going back. Once you miss it, it's gone. The one thing that is beneficial for this method, if it does work, if it does stick, if they can effectively learn to lip read, they are most likely to go into mainstream education. And then the third way to teach deaf students is total communication, which is a combination of basically everything. ASL, speech reading, sign English. It's kind of controversial, this method, because You're not only teaching ASL, you're teaching English. You can use pictures, miming, basically anything the teacher can come up with. This creates basically chaos from like school to school. Nobody uses the same methods to learn the same kind of words, the same kind of things. But the good thing about it is that English is taught simultaneously with ASL, so students become fluent in both languages.
All right, we're running out of time, but I'm going to talk about the challenges and the improvements that could be made. First of all, I want to make the differentiation between three different things. PSE, which is Pidgin Signed English, SEE, which is Signed Exact English, and then ASL, which is American Sign Language. So Pidgin Signed English is often used by those that learn the language later on in life. It's a mixture between ASL and Signed English, and so because of that, it varies. There's more of a spectrum, and so they use many English words, they use some English syntax, but they'll use signs from ASL. And so the idea is that some people may lean more towards the side of ASL, some may lean more towards Signed Exact English. Signed Exact English is exactly what it sounds like. It's that you're taking every exact syntax, idioms, verb endings, everything, and you're putting that all together. And so this was one of the first kinds of signed languages that came out with English. And the idea is that it's literally a visual counterpart of English. So it's the idea of writing is a written counterpart, I guess, whereas this is just a visual. This is very problematic because it's often used to teach. It can be used to teach deaf children, but it's not its own language. It's only a way to represent English, and there are a lot of issues that arise from that. And then ASL, we already know what that is, so I think we're going to jump past that. Some of the solutions to these problems, how to teach this better in schools. First of all, one of the main things could be utilizing a greater number of bilingual, bicultural schools. This helps cultivate the deaf community, and also it teaches ASL to those without prior knowledge, and it creates a community in which those individuals feel comfortable using ASL. Secondary from that, teaching ASL as a natural first language from a young age. This can be difficult if parents are hearing and the children do not, and the children are not, or vice versa. But teaching English as an L2 can be used as to better their education. And then finally, potentially using PSE and teaching hearing parents of deaf children could be utilized, but the main thing is to not use SEE because that is a very outmoded and not helpful form of signed English.
Are you ready for questions?
Yeah, I'm recording. So,
Elise?
So since most of us will be teachers in the future, we might not necessarily have students who are deaf, but for those hard of hearing, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind in our classrooms to help them feel?
Ask them what they're comfortable with. So a lot of times if they are hard of hearing, almost to the point of deaf, they oftentimes will have an interpreter with them. And so a lot of times it's very distracting. So when I was in ASL, they were like, don't look at the interpreter, look at me. They're not talking for me, or they're talking for me, but I'm the person that's talking.
Mm-hmm.
So they want you to basically just treat the interpreter as their voice because they can't speak or whatever, vice versa. But just ask them what they're comfortable with. Each student is going to be very different depending on the degree of their hard of hearing. So it just talk to them, figure out what they want, what sort of resources they're wanting from you. Because a lot of times if they're completely deaf, they won't be in a mainstream education school, but if they are, just make sure that they're comfortable, because it is something that's hard for them, because they are going to be more of an outcast because they do have to try to assimilate into the hearing world, which is something they're probably not comfortable with.
And along with that, there is clearly it's a spectrum, and so some people could be hard of hearing, but have a majority. And so, for example, I've seen in classrooms people that have they'll have a hearing aid and they'll have the professor wear a microphone, and so things like that. I think it's just, if it's something as simple as that, it's as easy as just asking and saying, you know, what can I do to accommodate? What do you need from me? But there's a wide spectrum that it could fall along.
Julie?
So, do you think for like the bilingualism part that like you should start out the child with ASL from the very beginning and then introduce English, or is it better to introduce them both at the same time, like because at younger ages you pick up languages faster, or is it harder if you do
It
that?
depends on what age you're trying to teach them, because students have, or not students, infants have the cognitive ability to use sign before that they have the cognitive ability to speak. So a lot of times it's easier to introduce ASL because they have language, they just don't know how to communicate. So if you introduce ASL first, when they're able to have the cognitive ability, when you're teaching them English, a lot of times you're not trying to teach them spoken English, you're just trying to teach them the way to write, because there is no ASL written form. So you're not teaching them to speak. So the first thing that you want to try and introduce is ASL, because the cognitive abilities are there before the cognitive abilities are for speaking English.
Janelle?
The first, Julie just said it, bilingual, what's it called?
Bilingualism?
Yeah, Becky had mentioned that it wasn't really taught outside of deaf schools, but given that you may have a deaf student in your classroom, even though you said that's not very likely, how would you implement that method specifically into your classroom? What could you do?
To teach bilingualism or to accommodate an ASL?
Kind of a little bit of both. Could you implement that in your classroom?
Unless you know ASL and are
Yeah, it'd
teaching
be
it, you can't
extremely
teach bilingual.
difficult to implement it if you don't know how to speak it yourself. One thing that I found when I was reading is relying heavily on visual aids that allow a student to see what you're talking about without having to hear it necessarily, so that they can still be fully involved in whatever it is you're trying to do in class.
So like having visuals would be a good accommodation for them.
Or you could just learn the basic things like yes, no, that alphabet is something very easy to pick up, and that way you could communicate with them in the slightest. Because it kind of is frustrating to have to, I've heard first-person accounts of where the interpreter is the only form of communication, and the interpreter will hear something, not say it completely, like not saying what the teacher's saying exactly, and give the wrong message to the student. So then the student's not learning everything completely. So if you learn the basics to communicate with your student, it opens a whole doors of like trust, open-minded communication, because they can still write to you. So if you're open door saying like, hey, I want to talk to you, I don't want to talk to your interpreter, I feel like that speaks mounds to the student.
Okay, I think that's all the time we really have.
Julian.
All right. So are the different sign languages just flat out like incompatible, or can people try to interact? Like in standard American English and British English are like, we can sort of understand British English speakers, but are the sign languages incompatible?
So there are family trees of sign languages, as there are with native language or with spoken languages. ASL comes from LSF, which is French Sign Language. And basically, when ASL first kind of came around, it was a combination, a mixture of French signs, local signs, things like that, and then just typical like body postures that would convey message. But in general, as of now, it's the same as if it were English and French. You might not be able to understand a single thing, but there might be some things that are
A
similar.
lot of it stems from some of the gestures are offensive in other cultures. So when we give a thumbs up in other cultures, that's like giving the middle finger. So you don't want to have the symbols don't translate across all things. Just like if you say one word here, it could mean something completely offensive in another culture. So it's just the same thing.